Good afternoon to all of you. It seems to have a very, very large room to actually give a presentation, to be honest with you. Anyway, my name is Brian Donovan, and I work with the company Find My Past. I've been involved in Irish research for more than 20 years. And I want to talk today about the differences between British and Irish research. They look superficially similar. We all know they're different. Well, you better know they're different. You'll find out afterwards anyway if you don't know now. But I wanted to try and delve in a bit more into those differences to try and help you in doing your research. Now, obligatory message, I'm very happy if you take a photograph of any slide I have here. Feel free to do that. I prefer if you didn't video record this or audio record it, because it's being recorded anyway, so you don't need to. So you can actually get access to it whenever you like. I'm going to be looking at a lot of things today. I've got over 100 slides, and that's dangerous because I've only got 60 minutes to do it in, so I'm going to do this quite quickly. I would ask you to hold on to your questions until the end, because the format we have today, because of the recording, makes it difficult to actually interrupt the lecture, which I normally allow people to do, but not today, if you don't mind. So I want to start by looking at the historical background, the fundamental differences between Britain and Ireland. If you don't know them, I'm going to march through our history a little bit. Our relationship between Ireland and Britain has not been always very friendly. These are more images from the early 20th century during the Irish War of Independence. And that has made Ireland and its record-keeping fundamentally different. But genealogy in Ireland is fundamentally different for other reasons as well. A lot of our records are destroyed. Our language is different. Our culture is different. Religious differences abound in Ireland. The country was incredibly poor for a very long time. So you have to bear all of these things in mind when you're facing Irish research. The country was conquered over centuries on the cheap. That causes a difference in record keeping, a different type of types of records you might use. The country was colonized by many different groups and peoples at different times during the thousands of years, incompletely. And the Irish themselves were semi-assimilated into the broader British nation, this concept of a British nation, which is a bit artificial. So the Irish are both quite similar in many respects to our neighbors, but we're also quite different. Our language was often different, and the relationship between the islands, it was deeply insecure. So that actually was both an advantage and a disadvantage for your research. The Irish are just different. So let's look a little bit at the differences. This is an interesting map which was created by a former Prime Minister, Taoiseach of Ireland, Garret FitzGerald. He was an unusual statistician, and he did odd things during his otherwise normal job running the country. And one of which was to map everybody over the age of 60 who was an Irish speaker in the 1911 census. And from that, you could get a picture of what were the Irish-speaking areas in Ireland in 1845, around the time of the start of the famine. This is a map of where the Irish speakers lived at that time. So language is a fundamental difference. To give you one example of why that language issue is so important, the English were often incredibly confused by the Irish because there is no Irish word for yes or no. And that caused enormous difficulties between the relationships between the people, besides everything else I've talked about. But also the Irish are not just one group or one nationality or one ethnic group either. You must remember the Irish, just like people everywhere in the world, are an amalgam of people who've come from elsewhere, who've moved there. So who are the Irish, or where do they come from? There's those who are of Gaelic origin, who we traditionally think of as the Irish, but there are many of Viking origin. During the Norman conquest, we had Norman, Welsh, Flemish, Anglo-Saxon who moved to Ireland. The Scots were continuously moving into what is now Northern Ireland, and also further afield as well. English, French, German, Italian, Jewish, and many other groups. And of course, in the 20th and 21st century, we've had many, many other groups who've moved to Ireland as well. This is part of our normal process. So what does that mean in terms of naming? And I hope Dr. Schultz doesn't mind so much that I've actually borrowed one of his images. But here's a picture of Mr. Black and Mr. Brown. That's an English name. Who is Mr. Black and who is Mr. Brown? Let's call them Jack Black and James Brown. And I've decided to put up my description of who they might be in an Irish context. So Jack Black could be Sean O'Crohor Dove, or John O'Connor, or Jack Black, because Dove is the Irish for black. And if you lived in a community where everybody had the same last name, you found subsidiary surnames were very useful to distinguish between which O'Connor, or O'Crohor as it is in Irish, is of which group. And they would often add a color, or possibly they would have another phrase about them. They're the big, the more, or the beag, the small. Or here's another example. We have James Brown. In Ireland, he could have been Seamus MacDonald Don McSweeney Nadeau. Now, there's so much richness to that name in the Irish language, not just in the actual pronunciation, but that tells you that Seamus, James, in Irish, is a son of Donal, MacDonald. Don, he's Brown. McSweeney, he's of the Sweeneys. So you have all that information that's been recorded there. So bear in mind, when you look at Ireland, the further you go back, the more likely it is your ancestors didn't speak English. And when they arrived in this country, they might not have spoken English either. So when you listen or when you hear the recorded name on the immigration form or otherwise, it's a clerk who wrote it down and they heard the name or they tried to interpret the name. Well, here are two images. These are the two traditional images of the Irish. The happy leprechaun who's looking for his pint of beer, or the destitution of the famine. But let's face it, both of these are equally simplistic and inaccurate, but they're not completely wrong either. I want to look at some big differences in Irish genealogy, which is important for you to get to grips with, compared to Britain. And one of them is the geographic divisions on the island and how they formed. And I'm going to try and run through this chronologically to give you a history of why these boundaries are there and why they're useful for you to know about. Some of these are less important than others, but I think it's worthwhile getting a broad grip of it. First of all, the province. Some of you may know, or I hope most of you know, that Ireland is made up of 4 historic provinces. To make matters more complicated, when the Irish provinces originated in the mists of time, thousands of years ago, they were actually 5 provinces. So the Irish word for province is Cuaig, a 5th. There are only 4. There's a reason for that. But the 4 provinces that are there at the moment, Ulster, Connacht, Munster, and Leinster, you'll notice there on the map that not all of Ulster is in Northern Ireland and vice versa. You can see the boundary there. But those aren't terribly important for your research. It's just useful to know. What will become increasingly important is probably the oldest territorial division in Ireland, the townland. And the townland is a great example of cultural confusion. Why is it called a townland? Because there's clearly no towns in them. There's like 65,000 of these in the country. So why are they called townlands? Well, because that's an English translation of a Saxon word when the Anglo-Saxons moved into Ireland, where they used the Saxon word tún. And tún means a farmstead. Because the Irish word for these places were baile. Baile is the Irish for farm. So when you see a townland, it's actually a baile or a bailiana. And they could range in size from 1 to 5,000 acres, and they're all over Ireland. And they only standardized the boundaries of these in the 1830s when the Ordnance Survey worked across Ireland to actually map these out. But they're fairly permanent over a much longer period, and they've been in existence for probably well over 1,500 years. This is the unit that you really want to identify your ancestor in to make your research in Ireland really easy. But bear in mind, the Irish move around too. The barony is the next oldest, even though it's an English word, barony. It's based on the Cantred, these are established in Ireland following the Norman conquest, and they're based on the Gaelic Irish tua, or lordship. And there are about 6, maybe as many as 12 in every county. And they're useful because they were used as an administrative unit in earlier times, particularly for policing and for collection of tax and some other things. And they're quite valuable from that perspective. You won't use them terribly often, but they're useful to understand why they're there. The diocese, the churches, whether the Catholic or it's the Episcopalian Church in Ireland, are structured using dioceses. And they have very, very similar structures, irrespective of the denomination. And these date back to the medieval period, and they're quite complex, stretched right across the country in instances. And these are important to know when you're using many, many types of records as to what the dioceses are. The parish, though, is probably the most important for you. Now, what we call the civil parish in research is actually a slightly inaccurate term. Basically, these are the parish structures that existed throughout most of the Church's history in Ireland, right up to the Reformation. And after the Reformation, the established church, that is the legally constituted church in the country, which was the Church of Ireland, the Episcopalian Church, what Irish people call a Protestant church. I think most other countries, I think of them as sort of halfway house between Protestant and Catholic, but in Ireland they're quite clearly a Protestant church to most people. They held on to that same structure, and they would amalgamate the parishes together to create larger parishes. And they still remain in use for many administrative functions. In fact, even the petty sessions courts established in the 1820s, they amalgamated civil parishes into their court structure. So they're important to understand these. But they're not to be confused with Catholic parishes, which look different. And here's an example of the Catholic parishes for the same county, Wexford. I'm from Wexford, so I have no apologies for the fact that I use images from Wexford a bit, but I try to mix it around a little bit as well. So the Catholic Church, when they re-established themselves in Ireland after the Reformation, you must understand Ireland was being conquered at the same time by our neighbours, so they had difficulty re-establishing themselves, and they established new boundaries for new parishes, which would divide over time as more priests came in and more churches were built. And so they have their own history, but you need to know which parishes existed at a particular time to see which records you need to look at within parish records. And counties, the most fundamental unit for looking in Irish research. You must get your family back to a county to have any chance of doing Irish research successfully. The counties have their own history, and they're only finally set in stone in 1606, which may seem fairly old from your perspective, but I mean, compared to all those other territorial divisions, they're quite late. And again, the map I've showed here shows you the counties that are in the Republic of Ireland now and in Northern Ireland, the 6 counties in Northern Ireland and 26 in the Republic. The last major administrative change that I want to raise here today is the advent of the Poor Law Union. And the Poor Law Union, these were set up to collect tax to support a new poor law, which was designed to build workhouses and to provide rudimentary poor relief. They were obviously exceptionally important during the famine because the fact that they were in existence meant that less people died. But they became the units for a lot more than just simply poor relief. They were the units for civil registration of births, deaths, and marriages. They become the units for census records, for many, many other functions of the state. So they're very useful to know as well. And there are a number of publications out there which will help you track these boundaries. Now, the next major difference between Irish research and British research is the destruction of records. This is an image taken on that fateful day in June 1922 when some cultural barbarians decided to destroy the Public Record Office of Dublin. This is a picture of what it looked like prior to that destruction. Sorry, this is running away with me. There we go. The Public Record Office of Ireland in Dublin was a purpose-built archive established some years prior to 1922. It was one of the best archives in Europe. As a result of the destruction of the Public Record Office, we have lost the 1821, 31, 41, and 51 census records. Those census records were of extraordinary detail, as I'll describe in a moment. We lost over 50% of our Church of Ireland parish registers, which is extremely important given the religious composition of the country, which I'll also come back to in a bit. And we lost most of our wills and our court records. Not all of them, thankfully, but a lot of them. Bear in mind as well that destruction of records is not limited to that fateful day. We had already destroyed our 1861 and 1871 census on purpose. The 1881 and 1891 censuses were destroyed by bureaucratic mistake because there was a need for extra paper during the First World War. Now, the difference in Ireland was that we had our original census returns, but we had no enumerator's books. When you look at census records online, you nearly always look at an enumerator's book, not the original census return returned by the family. We didn't keep enumerators' books in Ireland. So when they put out the call, it was a British call to destroy the original census paper, to try and create paper, they just didn't realize there was no enumerators books in Ireland. So there's plenty of blame to go about. Now let's look at records. Records that we do have, and what the differences are there between what we have for Ireland and for Britain. Just like Britain, we have census records, BMDs, and parish registers, but there are differences, significant differences here. Let's run through them. Birth, marriage, death records. What's different between Ireland and Britain? Well, civil registration unusually starts very late in Ireland, and I say unusually because traditionally any new plan or any new government initiative was always tried out in Ireland first, any British initiative. And they tried it out in Ireland first because if it didn't work, it wasn't the end of the world, and if it did work, then they could roll it out in England afterwards. You can see that happening through virtually every single activity of the government, except for the one case we could really have done with it, civil registration, which only starts in 1864 for births, deaths, and marriages. We have non-Catholic marriages going back earlier, from the 1st of April 1845, and that's really useful to have it, but our civil registration starts very late, and that's one of the reasons why parish records are so important in Ireland. The records are available in the main, almost entirely, on irishgenealogy.ie for free, so I'd recommend that you actually use that site. They have not only an index of the material, it's a rudimentary index, but you get access to the images for free as well. Whilst it's not strictly a BMD, our wills in Ireland and probate was the responsibility of the Church of Ireland, like so many other functions, until 1858, just like England. So that's one bit which is the same. Census records, we also have them in not quite the abundance you have for England, but they are similar. There were significant differences, though. The Irish census records of 1821, 41, and 51 were full name records. Every name was recorded. The fact that most of them were destroyed makes it even more disappointing and distressing. Also, those early census records asked about absences, people who were away from home on the night of the census because they may have emigrated. They also asked about who had died since the previous census. They didn't do this in England. Again, a lot of these records have been destroyed, but we do have some surviving. So our first complete census record in Ireland is 1901. And the 1911 and 1901 censuses are both online. They're both available widely online. And they're available on Find My Past, on the National Archives of Ireland website, and elsewhere. But there are nearly 500,000 pre-1901 census survivals. And there are also search forms, census search forms. And I want to show you some examples of these because they're important. This is an example from 1911. These are all really available online, so you can go and find out what these look like. They're the original returns by the families as well. Here's an 1821 census return for the townland of Inisheer, the island of Inisheer, the Aran Islands off the west coast of Galway. And you see all the names for the entire household are recorded here, their ages and their occupations. You'll also notice that the names are recorded in English, even though I can guarantee you every single one of these people would have been a monoglot Irish speaker. They wouldn't have had a word of English between them. So you have that problem of that name difference, even when these things do survive. Here's an 1831 census return for Derry, for Londonderry, the county of Derry. And again, you only get the heads of households in 1831, but you get the numbers of people in the rest of the family and the numbers of people by denomination as well, whether they're Catholic, Protestant, Presbyterian, and so on. And this example from 1851, census return again. It's only 500,000 names, but it's still 500,000 names. And if you do find your family in those, you'll get a real treat. I talked about other census records which actually can fill in the gaps. Well, we have the census search forms. What are these? Well, in 1908, we brought in a pension in Ireland, but you had to show you were 70. You worked that out. 1908, 70? Well, there weren't any birth records, or certainly civil registers of births, which have been good enough to actually bring in to prove you were 70. So how did you prove you were 70? Well, you had to fill in a form to do a search of the 1841 or the 1851 census. And this is what they look like, the forms. And you brought them in to search. We've got another 150,000 people from the 1841 and 51 census are recorded in these search forms, which survive. You also, of course, get the names of the people who are applying for a pension too, which is quite useful. But because of all that destruction and the fact that records start late is the reason why parish registers in Ireland are the most important source you're going to use. You must remember that Ireland was a pluralist country. Now, pluralist basically means you had people of different denominations living close by each other. They probably hated each other, but maybe they didn't. Intermarriage between people of different faiths is entirely ordinary in Ireland. Just because the late 19th century, the Irish become very rigidly adherent to particular faiths, particularly the Catholic Church, as it becomes more and more confident and starts to separate itself out, we still have this vision in our mind that the Irish have always been the same. In 1841, 38% of the Irish population were not Catholic. And that is more than a decade, 15 years after the Catholic Church had been made legal completely. That doesn't mean that there wasn't sectarianism in Ireland. It was widespread, and it's one of the great curses of our history. But bear in mind that Irish Protestants do migrate in proportionally higher numbers. They may have been the minority, though not a hugely, close to 40%, as I said, but because they were generally English speakers, they were closer to the East Coast, they had a better chance of having maybe a few more pounds, could more easily afford, I should say, not easily, but they could more easily afford to get passage that they came across. They did come across in much higher numbers. So let's see what we have. The Catholic records are probably the most comprehensive that exist in Ireland, which is particularly useful given the other instructions. And they date from 1670. Now, the Catholic records survive much better for the urban areas than the rural areas. That's probably because the churches, Catholic churches themselves, found it easier to operate within the cities and the towns. And it took quite some time, because of the penal laws and the oppression of the Catholic Church and its exclusion, it made it very difficult for them to organize well. Though, bear in mind, it was always easier to be Catholic in Ireland than it was in Britain. And a lot of English people, and Scots for that matter, who are Catholic, moved to Ireland because it's easier to be Catholic there. Virtually all of the Catholic records are now in line. The images are put online by the National Library, and you can see them here. And we at Find My Past indexed them and put on an index plus the images for free, and we've committed ourselves to making them free forever. Now, there are other indexes for Catholic records. Here's the work of the Irish Family History Foundation, Roots Ireland, have covered a lot of this material as well, only in index form. They don't have the images. Their indexes of Catholic records are also very good, well worth checking against the ones you'll find in Find My Past or in Ancestry or anywhere else, because every index is different, and it's just an index, bear that in mind. But for other denominations, there's a limited amount of material here. They've done quite a bit of Church of Ireland records for some counties. Other Protestant denominations like Presbyterian and Methodist has been quite poor still, and they haven't covered things like Jewish records and so on. But it's still worthwhile looking at. IrishGenealogy.ie, which I mentioned before for civil records, they also have certain denominations in certain counties. So they have a lot of the Catholic records for Dublin City. They've got the Church of Ireland records for Dublin City, Presbyterian records for Dublin City, both Catholic and Church of Ireland records for Kerry, West Cork, and Carlow. And they have the civil registration records I mentioned before. So that's well worth using as well. The Church of Ireland records for Dublin are particularly good. They're all scanned in colour. And bear in mind, the Church of Ireland had the responsibility for burying everybody. So their burial registers are comprehensive for all denominations in the cities. A little bit more in Church of Ireland records. I've mentioned some of these things before. The established church had many, many local government responsibilities beyond births or baptisms and marriages for their own denomination. And it's worthwhile being aware of what those records are, because it can be very useful for your research. You'll get most Church of Ireland records for the Republic of Ireland in the Representative Church Body Library, and in Northern Ireland in the Public Record Office of Northern Ireland. Also, I'm pleased to announce that we've actually just released on Find My Past the Rosemary Folliot's wonderful transcriptions of parish registers from all over Ireland. There's about 500,000 records from the Church of Ireland which have come online recently. And this is an example of other Church of Ireland functions, including running the police, parish watches, which are very useful. But there are many other denominations that were historically in Ireland who hardly exist there anymore. You're probably wondering, Irish Quakers? I haven't heard of any Irish Quakers. Yeah, you wouldn't have heard of any Irish Quakers because they're all here. They all came here quite early, but for the period of time that the Quakers were in Ireland, they have comprehensive records from 1660 onwards, and they're all online. They include births, marriages, burials, sufferings, migrations, and so on. And you may ask yourself, my ancestor wasn't Quaker. Well, I mentioned that Ireland's pluralist. Just because they aren't Quaker doesn't mean they actually didn't attend Quaker events. And why is that valuable? We'll find out in a minute. These are Quaker birth records. The Quakers are obsessed with meetings. The great thing about meetings is they record huge numbers of names, quarterly meetings, monthly meetings, and so on. They recorded every single thing that happened to the community which was considered bad. There's books of registers of sufferings. This is a register of sufferings from 1695 because they had to pay the local tithes, local tax, basically. But they name all of the people not only who didn't pay, but also those people who came to collect from them. They're all named. These are all indexed and online too. Also, disownments. The Quakers were remarkable at throwing people out. I mean, in fact, actually, the head of the Quaker Archive in Ireland jokes that it's amazing there's any Quakers in Ireland at all because they kept on getting thrown out for doing things that were wrong, including selling spirits and wine, which is the case of here, or marrying out of the church as well. And also moving. Here's an example of the removal register, and this is where Joshua Fuller Doyle of Dublin in 1795 is moving to the meeting in Philadelphia, and he has his official letter, which is recorded in a register, giving details of him and his family and where they're going to. And then I mentioned before about being the pluralist society. When you had a Quaker marriage, everybody who attended the marriage was listed at the end of the marriage, and every single one of those names is recorded and indexed. The Quaker records are all online at Find My Past. So there are more denominations to the Catholic, is what I want to try and get through to you. And don't assume your family were ever one religion only. That would be a major mistake. I want to talk now a little bit about the Irish opportunity. We don't do enough of this. It's not all doom and gloom in Irish research. It's not all record destruction and historical misery. We have stuff that the English don't have. I get great pleasure in saying that. But we have great records, and it's thanks to them and what they did that we have great records. And there are two things that actually obsessed the English no end about Ireland, and they had to invest heavily in, and they kept huge amounts of records about. And those two issues are the security of the country and trying to control the population, because the Irish are, infamously unruly, and also trying to control who owned and occupied the land. So we have records in abundance for these. So I'm going to try and run through them quickly. Land. Why was land important? Because it's a major economic resource. And for a colonial administration in the country, the English, they wanted to know who controlled it so they could actually have understanding of where the potential problems are going to happen. And this goes way back into the 17th century, the 1600s. It's the most surveyed part of the British Empire. And they wanted to know who was loyal to what religion, because that might indicate whether they were a danger to the state itself. But they were also interested in the occupation of land as well. So the earliest records that we have around this are from the mid-17th century, during the Cromwellian administration in Ireland. And they were very much focused on identifying the religious denomination of owners, not the occupiers of land. And we have the Civil Survey and Down Survey, both of which in one shape or form are online. The Down Survey in this wonderful project, and just don't worry about taking down URLs here, it's all part of the handout you're going to get. So the downsurvey.tcd.ie, they have actually managed to put them all online with their maps. It's wonderfully detailed. The Irish Manuscripts Commission have published the Civil Survey pretty much completely as well. That's an example of a Down Survey map. These are quite early. I'm unlikely for most of you to need to use it. A little bit later, the Williamite surveys from the late 17th century, they also are interested about who owned land, and they're mostly interested about Catholics owning land and confiscating that land, just like the Cromwellian surveys. So they're useful when you start getting back to individuals who might have been landowners. But they get more valuable in terms of the broader population as you move forward in time. In 1707, we had an extremely important institution which was set up in Dublin called the Registry of Deeds. Now, this organization, or this repository, was a place to actually prove security of tenure for these new owners. And under legislation that existed at the time, if you could actually show that your deed of ownership was registered with the Registry of Deeds, you had a prior claim to anybody else. So as you can imagine, many of these new owners who got their lands by confiscation and so on were quite keen in getting their estates registered there. But during the 18th century, the 1700s, the Catholic farmers became aware of the fact that maybe I should take my lease and have it registered in there too. It protects me against losing my land against a rapacious landlord or a dispute with a neighbor. So during the course of the 1700s, you have a lot of tenant farmers, bigger tenant farmers, recording their leases here. And as you move into the 19th century, more again. So they become increasingly important for an entire sector of society. We estimate that about 30% of the country is represented in these records. So it's not just the 1% or the 5% who own the property of Ireland. It's a very large chunk of what I would describe as the middle class of their day, most of whom would have been of every denomination. So this extremely important records collection, which is only partially online. Family Search imaged all of it, and all those images are available for free on their website, which of course is useful to a point because there are indices which you can use and work back to the original deed, but it is cumbersome. There's been a wonderful volunteer project called the Irish Deeds Index, which have been gathering together indexes to a lot of this, but it's still only a very slim minority they've done. But the great news is that the Registry of Deeds are now themselves engaging and starting a project to digitize their entire collection. So that'll be one of the most important things to keep an eye out for over the next 5 years or so. Beyond that, there's much more about land as well we can cover. And I'm going to try and do this quickly. But the Ordnance Survey, I mentioned them earlier on, is setting out the boundaries of townlands finally. But between 1829 and 1913, they mapped Ireland repeatedly at greater and greater levels of detail. And all these maps are available online as well through the Ordnance Survey today. You can use them for free. And it's well worth looking at their maps because they go right down to 25 inches to a mile, right? Okay, they're incredibly detailed. You can see every single plot and every single house is recorded in there. And they were used for the Valuation Office, which I'll be talking about next. The Valuation Office, another effort in recording land occupation now, not ownership particularly, but land occupation. And the Valuation Office was set up at the same time as the poor law unions, because it was set up to try and establish what tax was going to be paid to support the new poor laws, the unions. Now, thankfully, in Ireland, we had a complete psychopath who was responsible for the operation of setting out this valuation system. There's a picture of him there, Sir Richard Griffith. I call him a psychopath because he was, it's probably unfair to call him a psychopath, but he was one of these, not one of nature's nice guys. He was famous for firing staff a year before they had got their pension entitlements at the end of their career. I mean, he was sort of penny-pinching guy. But what made him interesting from our perspective is that he insisted on a very detailed survey of the country to establish exactly what tax should be paid. In Britain, they didn't do this in anywhere level of detail, nowhere near the level of detail we had in Ireland. So these rates, and the county cess beforehand, the old local tax, was all brought together in this. And it started with the first valuations, which are the house books and the field books. And these were carried out in the 1820s and 30s into the early 40s. Don't confuse them with the Griffiths valuation now. These are earlier, by 5 or 10 or even 15 years. And they will list off everybody who's occupying a house and what the value of the house is. Many of these houses were mud huts. They literally were nothing. So you can cover a lot of the population. These are mostly online. About 2/3 of them are online at Find My Past. They're also available online at the National Archives website for free. And they detailed those house ownerships, occupations I should say, not ownership. And you get the names and the description and the actual layout of the house. But of course, that was only a preliminary to what became the primary valuation. The first valuation, the primary valuation, I mean, it's terribly confusing. But the primary valuation is what you would know is the Griffiths valuation. How many people in this room have never heard of the Griffiths valuation? Okay, there's a few, more than I would have thought, but let me run through it really quickly. The Griffiths valuation, what we call the Griffiths valuation, the primary valuation, is that tax record that I mentioned at the beginning. It lists every occupier of land. They had to have an interest of 12 months or more. So what you won't find in these records are urban dwellers who are on week-by-week leases of a flat. But you'll get everybody who's a farmer in here. You get their name, you get the person they pay rent to, the immediate lessor, you get a description of the property, which is usually tells you whether they have outbuildings, and they tell you, you can find out exactly what the nature of the land is, whether it's arable or bog or so on. And you get the acreage, and then you also get the valuation of the land and the valuation of the house. And these are widely available online. They're available on Find My Past, but they're also available on Ask About Ireland, and there's maps available for them as well. I could give just a lecture just on this source, but I don't have time. But the Griffiths valuation may have been the first time the country got valued, but it wasn't the last time. And the Griffiths valuation was updated year by year right up to the 1970s. And if you're doing work on the 6 counties of Northern Ireland, you're in luck, because all of that's been digitized and put online. It's not indexed, but if you know somebody who was in a particular townland, you can go and find the books, and you can go through them page by page over the century and find out what happened to that property, whether it's still there, whether it's still in occupation, or so on. They're a difficult source to use, but they're enormously rich and very detailed. Those for the Republic of Ireland are available through the Valuation Office and are not available online. But there is a microfilm set of them in the Family History Library here in Salt Lake. It's a black and white microfilm, which is kind of annoying because they're color-coded, but you can still just about work with them. Now, another set of land records. I mean, there's tons of land records for Ireland, which you just don't have in England. I could go on for hours about this, but we have the land of the State Court rentals. Now, what is the land of the State Court? Well, we all know a great crisis happened in the middle of the 19th century in Ireland, the famine. 1 million people die, 1 million people emigrate. A quarter of the population are gone. The government was quite concerned, particularly because landlords were going bankrupt. So, like often happens in periods of great economic uncertainty, the government will step in to bail out the people who probably least need to be bailed out, in this case, the landowners. With the land of the State Court, individual landlords had only a life interest in their land. They didn't have the right to sell. They had an entail on the estate. So the land of the State Court allowed them to break the entail, and they would surrender their estate to the court. The court would then go and sell it. But in the process of selling it, they would produce a rental of who were the tenants on the land. And often those rentals would describe the date of the original lease and give you lots of information. So we have 500,000 people, because almost a quarter of the estates of Ireland were sold under this system. So there's a 1 in 4 chance that your rural people will be in these records. It's part of the first significant breakup of estates in Ireland. They're exclusively available in Find My Past, and they include huge amounts of detail. I'm going to give you a couple of examples here. This is 2 individual leaseholdings which are recorded in one rental. Those leases are dated from the 1790s. It describes the name of the lease, who had originally been granted the lease, and the changes in that lease and over the course of the intervening 50 or 60 years. It's also not just for the bigger properties. This is a list of tenants who have no lease, and they pay year by year. Like at the harvest every year, they go to the landlord, they pay their rent, and they're told whether they can have it for another year or not. I mean, there's a large percentage of the Irish population who have really impermanent control of their land. And these are there too. And they have maps. And the maps are wonderfully detailed too. That's land. I mentioned that. But the British and the English were equally concerned about the general population. We have a history of rebellion in Ireland. I don't know if you know. We made it difficult for our neighbours. And as a consequence of which, we have twice the number of police in Ireland, we have twice the number of courts, we have far many more prisons, and we have far more interaction with the security apparatus. There are aspects of 19th century Ireland which are like a police state. And that's another big difference between England and Ireland. I'm going to show you this record you've got there in front of you. You probably can't read it terribly clearly, but I'm going to point out a few details. This is a wonderfully interesting record carried out in 1864 comparing crime rates in England and crime rates in Ireland. And they try and level it up so there's roughly the same population. And as you go through it, it's fascinating the differences that are there. For example, and it sort of like dispels a lot of myths along the way. You'll find out the English were twice as likely to be done for stealing. There's one myth gone. The Irish, however, were 3 times as likely to be done for willful and malicious destruction of property. The Irish were twice as likely to be done for common assaults, fist fight outside a pub on a Saturday night, that sort of stuff. The English were far more likely to be done for breaching or poaching game. The Irish were more likely to be done for poaching fish. I mean, it's kind of interesting. Why that is, we don't know. The English were many times more likely to be done for breaching workhouse regulations. The Irish are much more orderly, much more obliging to the law within the workhouse, which is kind of unusual. The Irish were 3 times more likely to be done for prostitution. We should not be surprised by this. The relationship between the countries is very different. Dublin had the largest red light zone in Europe in the 19th century, pretty much catering for the aristocracy of Britain. On a slightly lighter note, the Irish were 3 times as likely for not paying tax, and 3 times as likely to be done for drunkenness. But those are all just, we could have an entire lecture about the reasons for any of these things, and it won't actually help. What I want you to take is one thing at the very bottom line. The Irish are more than twice as likely to end up in a court or a prison. There's twice the number of court cases and convictions in Ireland than there is in England. So it's a much, much more secure. This is great for us. Now, I said before that many of the court records are destroyed. The most important set of records for Ireland weren't, which are the petty sessions, the magistrates' courts. You still have magistrates' courts here. We got rid of them in independence. But they were established by statute in 1827. We have comprehensive record keeping from 1851 onwards. We have more court cases and petty sessions than we have civil registration cases of birth, marriage, and death. Okay? It's a wonderfully important source. And it's all available online at Find My Past as well. Full images and all the names. Now, it only covers what is now the Republic of Ireland, but it's still incredibly detailed, and the stories in there are wonderful. There's a cartoon I have here from Punch magazine in London describing what an Irish court looked like, which is rather typical English interpretation of the Irish. But the thing that's accurate about it is the fact that more than half the cases are civil cases, so disputes between neighbors, which is really important, it's really interesting. It's not just cases of theft and so on. This is what a court looked like. It's one of the only pen and ink sketches we have of a petty sessions court. And you'll see on the right-hand side the judge, who's probably the local landlord. And you've got a couple of policemen in the background, obviously bringing people there, bringing it to court. You have a recorder sitting on the bench to the left-hand side. He filled in the books that we digitized. And that's an example of what these books look like. And they give you an idea of just the stories. I'll give you this one story here. This is from Temple Moor in Tipperary in 1898. And in this story, we have a Joanna Maher who brings her brother, Patrick, to court. Why? We're told that on the 14th of August, there was a dispute between them. Apparently, Patrick accused Joanna of being a witch. And it went on to say that Joanna accuses Patrick of being a dangerous lunatic. Now, you might think, titter, will laugh, and so on. But how did the court deal with this? Well, the court decided to send Patrick off to the local district lunatic asylum. And under Irish legislation, right up to the 1960s, any family member could bring another family member to court, and if the judge agreed, they would be sent to a mental institution. The capacity for abuse of that system is worthy of an entire talk by itself. But there are many other reasons why cases appear, but you can see the sort of family disputes that appear and erupt inside a courtroom. Here's an example from 1834. 1834, this is like more than 10 years before the famine, from Castletownbere, where we hear about Daniel Sullivan of Caherkeen and Daniel Kelly of Allihies, and people like this that you would never have records for. The parish records weren't even terribly good for these areas. And you have court cases about them. Or in 1841, Newmarket and Fergus. I mean, these are just wonderfully early records. And you know who the person was who was responsible for this record keeping? Bram Stoker, the man who wrote Dracula. He had a day job. This is his day job. He looked after what all the clerks of petty sessions did writing those books. Anyway, music aside. Prison registers, another wonderful thing. We had more prisons per population than anywhere else in Europe. They date back to the 1790s. 2.7 million prisoners recorded prior to 1922. Now, this is out of a population that had this maximum of 8 million people. I mean, this is a huge percentage. I mean, up to 100,000 people were in prison in any one year. Like, you could put it in perspective, there's 12,000 people in prison in Ireland today. You know, that's huge. And of course, the prisons, famously Spike Island, where people were detained before they were sent to Australia. And the records are incredibly detailed. Here, I'll give you one example. Might give you another one. No, I'll give you one example. This is from Galway in the early part of the 20th century. We hear that Patrick Ward, who's a tinsmith, He's 46 years old. He's 5 foot and 9 inches. He's got red hair, blue eyes, fresh complexion. He's got tattoos all over his arm, and they describe what's on the tattoos. They tell you he's born in Johnstown in Athlone, and his last resident was in Tuam. And they give you his wife's name, Mary Ward, who lives in Tubridy Road in Tuam. This man, he's a tinsmith. He's a traveller. I don't know if you know very much about Irish travellers. They're a separate community, but they've avoided interaction with the establishment throughout their existence. They generally didn't bother registering their children, or tried to avoid it as much as possible. They didn't want to have any involvement. But once you hit the security apparatus, we know everything about them. So, wonderfully detailed. And the prisons were used during the War of Independence and other conflicts. During internment, during the War of Independence, we have all the same names of people, all the same details about people, their relationships, their places of occupation, the places of birth, and so on. Wonderfully detailed. And even not just big events like the War of Independence, there are many, many individual local battles that happen in Irish history. For example, this is from Limerick Prison in the 1880s during the Land War. And you have a ton of people there. There's 13 people in the list who are all put in prison for the same reason. We'll zoom in and have a look at that reason. You probably can't even read this. But all of those people were put into prison for being members of an illegal secret society having for its objective the committing of murders, outrages, and intimidation. These are typical Land War campaigners. Huge process in the late 19th century to try and overturn landlordism. Extraordinarily, the English actually finally obliged and broke up the estates. They never did that in England. And there's many other records as well. The photographs, as soon as photography became available, it was brought into Ireland to be used to actually photograph the population, track them. You know, during the Fenian Rising in the 1860s, they just interned them all, photographed them, and told them to leave the country. They all came here. We got photographs of them all. And even more so, because, I mean, the police couldn't really deal with Ireland on many occasions, so Ireland was put under martial law. And we have these martial law records, and they are so, so informative. I mean, there's nothing valuable and nothing positive to say about living under martial law, but for us, it's great, because we've got all this information about these people. So we have martial law registers, we have case files, search and raid reports, so much more besides that. Here's an example of a martial law register from the War of Independence. And this gives you an idea of the sort of information. It tells you that the military went to Castle Comer, that's in Kilkenny, because a number of civilians were hanging about. And they all ordered all the civilians to put their hands up. And they all complied except one who turned around and said, "I defy the military." And they shot him. And they brought him, and in front of the court case here, he's given 14 days hard labor for being so disgraceful. Or in this case here, this is a search and raid report, and I love this one, because it's like a little mini census return. They tell you the name of the captain in charge who goes in there, the person they're going into the house of Thomas Hanrahan, who's in Kappa in Inistioge in County Kilkenny, and it tells you that Thomas Hanrahan was born in Kappa. He's a farmer, and they list all the family below hand and their relationship to each other. That's how detailed the security records are for Ireland. Now, in the case of all these records I've just been showing you here, these are all online on Find My Past as well, so please have a look at them. But the stories you build from this, that is Irish history. But there's so much more as well. Poor relief. Now, in Britain they'd had poor relief as well, but not to the same extent as we had in Ireland, because the country was so impoverished. So this was recognized by many people, philanthropic types. Because you know today how many philanthropists give money to microcredit schemes in South America or South Asia? Well, British people like that were doing the same in Ireland back in the early 19th century, and they set up in 1822 the Irish Relief Committee. And they set up this series of what they call reproductive loan funds. The idea is that we continually reproduce money to reinvest. And it was a microcredit scheme. And we have nearly 700,000 names in these records of people who got these microcredits. And why is this so important? Well, not just simply that they covered both men and women, which is unusual for the time, but not just because they because it's an early time frame. It's because it was giving money to the poor, and we have them from areas where we don't have records, and it's before the famine. Now, why is this particularly valuable? In the 1850s, after the famine, the loan fund went in to find out what had happened to their money. I'm going to give you one page of what they found. This lists 11 people, this page, who got money in the 1830s and 40s. Of those 11 people, in the intervening 10 years, 3 have emigrated, 2 were committed of crimes and transported to Australia. The rest are dead of starvation. Now, that's hard to see records like that. I'm going to give you one example. The 5th entry there is from a Dennis Bryan, who was always a very poor agricultural laborer, died of starvation in December 1846. We don't have records about the famine Irish often, but they do exist. It is possible, is what I'm trying to say. The poor law unions, I mentioned before, they had them in England too, but the Irish system, thankfully, it was there during the famine. I know the Irish have a bad relationship with workhouses. Most people do, but they were there. The system reached breaking point. It couldn't cope. So we had over 1 million dead, over 1 million emigrated. But we have records that survive for the workhouses. And we've put online so far at Find My Past, we've got an objective to do everywhere in the country. We've got the Donegal unions on, Dublin unions, Sligo unions. Now, I really mention Donegal particularly because the Donegal records are appalling. They don't last, they don't survive, largely because the climate's so poor. But we have not only workhouse registers, the Board of Guardian minute books as well, which are equally important for tracking people who are poor going through the system. And so many people who are poor went through the system were more likely to emigrate because there was nothing for them here. Here's an example of what one of these registers look like. You get the names, you get their ages, you get relationship to each other if they're coming in as a family, and where they're from, and what religion they were. Like most records in Ireland, we're obsessed with knowing what religion everybody is. So we're coming to the end of my talk here. I just want to finish up by talking about what happened to the records, because we've talked about destruction, but where is everything now? I've mentioned material that's online, but of course an awful lot of Irish records are not digitized. They're not available anywhere except in paper in the archive. Also, the country in Ireland was separated. It became 2 countries in partition in 1921, prior to Irish independence in 1922. The Irish Free State was founded, which is now the Republic of Ireland, and that included 26 counties, and you can see them, the yellow counties there, plus the green ones above from Ulster, because Ulster as a province was split. 3 counties went to the Republic, and the remaining 6 counties formed what is now the province of Northern Ireland, which is a constituent part of the United Kingdom. Also, because of that, they set up a new archive, the Public Record Office of Northern Ireland in Belfast, which makes matters more complicated again. Prony have taken their remit as all of Ulster, not just Northern Ireland, so they include those 3 counties which are part of the Republic. And many records that specifically related to what is now Northern Ireland were transferred up to Prony. And you can actually access them there. But many more are in Dublin. So if you're doing Northern Irish research or your ancestors are from Ulster, you need to go to both archives. And in fact, even if you're doing research from what is now the Republic of Ireland, it's still useful to go to Prony because they have records you don't have elsewhere. Now, I'm coming towards the end of the talk. I just bring your attention to the feedback form on your app that you got. Please do, if you thought this was any useful for your research, go along there and you'll see that clipboard icon. That's the clipboard icon right there. Click on it and rate the presentation. You can say I'm crap, you can say I'm good, you can say whatever you like, but please do, because it's valuable for the people who run it. And thank you for your time and attention. If you have any questions, feel free to ask. Well, one question here.
I'm trying to get back across the pond, but my ancestor was born about 1908 in Armagh, which is Northern Ireland, correct?
Yes, correct. Today's.
So, are you suggesting that the Ulster records would be the best, Prony would be the best place for me to
The gentleman's asking is his ancestor was born, what year was it?
1808.
1808 in County Armagh. County Armagh is now in Northern Ireland. He's wondering which archive does he need to go to. Well, for a start, you need to know quite a bit about who you're looking for. If you're looking at parish registers, Catholic parish registers, as I said, are online. You can use those. Do you know the denomination?
He registered as Church of England when he got to Canada.
Okay, he's probably Episcopalian then. In Ireland, he'd be Church of Ireland. Those records for Armagh are certainly going to be in the Public Record of Northern Ireland. And they are currently digitizing, scanning all of their Church of Ireland parish registers. Because the Church of Ireland being a state church, Even they didn't stop being a state church until after disestablishment in 1869, but the records prior to 1869 are the property of the state, unlike, say, Catholic records, which are private. So they're all in Prony. So contact them and see about getting access to the parish registers. Same would go for land records from there, particularly estate records. They will be available in Prony. But quite a lot of material is also available online, so try that there, so you try my pass. Are there any other questions? We've got a couple of minutes. There's a lady here at the front. Sorry, I probably can't see people at the back because it's quite bright, the lights.
I just want to ask, the records that are online, are they indexed or are they searched through?
The lady was asking about records online. Are they indexed? Well, I can talk confidently about Find My Past. Every name is indexed. In the records on irishgenealogy.ie, they're all name indexed. But on some other sites, maybe not everything is indexed. You may just have images. But like for the National Library's publication of Catholic parish registers, they just had just images. Any other questions? There's a gentleman, I think, further back here with your hand up. How mobile were people in the 19th century in Ireland? It's a really good question. I often give a presentation about tracing the impoverished Irish. Every Irish person who was rural who came to this country always recorded themselves as a farmer. Don't believe it. They were farm laborers. That's why they left the country. Farm laborers are highly mobile. They move from estate to estate to get work. And they're the first to move when things get tough. Because they have no permanence or no fixed reason to stay. If you're a farmer, you've got either a 12-month or you've got a 3-year or 5-year or 31-year lease. You're going to stay. You've got a vested reason to stay in the property. The vast majority of Irish people who emigrate are laborers. So they're highly mobile, to answer your question. We've got a couple of minutes. Lady here in the front.
Yes, can you talk about the difference in the records available at the GRO in Dublin versus the National Archives in Dublin?
Wanted to know the difference between the records available in the General Register Office in Dublin and the National Archives in Dublin. The General Register Office is responsible for civil registration of births, marriages and deaths. The historic births, marriages and death records are available in irishgenealogy.ie. Up to a certain point, births can only be made available after they're 100 years old, marriages after 75 and so on, and deaths after 50 years. However, you can look at all records, no matter how recent they are, of birth, marriages, and deaths, if you actually write to the General Register Office or you attend to them in person. The National Archives, on the other hand, are the repository for all state records created by the Republic of Ireland and their predecessors. Any other questions? I think I can take probably one more. Sorry, I can't see totally well. Sorry, I can't see. Whoever's the first person to stand up, please ask.
I'm a Murray. Are there certain sections of Ireland where the Murrays are from? I don't know where Thomas Murray came from.
The question is there a particular part of Ireland that the Murrays come from? Because the person's ancestor is Thomas Murray. The simple answer to that question is yes. Our Irish surnames are heavily localized. But to make matters more complicated, as I mentioned before, the Irish people move around a lot. So in a place like Dublin, you'd find people of surnames throughout the country. But the Murrays, I can't tell you off the top of my head where the Murrays are actually most concentrated in. I should, but it just escapes me at the moment. But I can promise you there is parts of the country where they're far more concentrated than others. The best way to do that is actually to try and look at some of the big surname books that we have, particularly the works of Edward MacLisaac, who was a former Chief Herald of Ireland, and he wrote several books on surname histories. There's also other groups like the Guild of One-Name Studies, which can be very valuable in trying to find out the concentrations in particular regions. I think that's me time-wise. There's only a few seconds left. So I'm sorry, I can't take any more questions, but if you'd like to come and chat to me afterwards, that'd be absolutely fine. I'll be outside the front in a moment. Thank you very much.